Hello, it's 20 years since the world peered into Romanian orphanages and saw the hell inside. But what's happened to those babies now? From the psychiatrist who's followed them for 2 decades, we hear how their recovery has contributed to our scientific understanding of the way the brain develops. And Janet's story.
It got to a point where I could not connect my emotions to my mental thinking. I think something, but I don't feel it. And it's so hard because you could really want to express an emotion, but I can't feel it. I'm like, what's love? Could you tell me what love is? How do you really feel it? What do you do when you love? It's like, I see it, but I can't feel it.
How early experience sculpts the brain. And drawing your pension, are you cheerfully counting down the days till you retire or anxiously counting the pennies? Retirement and mental health. But first, cast your mind back to 1989. Ceausescu's regime was coming to an end, and soon we'd be seeing the first TV pictures from inside Romania's orphanages.
An international relief effort has helped to transform the lives of some of the children in Romania's orphanages. Their plight was unearthed after the fall of the Ceausescu regime.
Inside, the neglect and deprivation of the Ceausescu years had left pitiful scenes. Children living in their own filth, usually with no one to care for them.
There was just one member of staff for 30 babies. They spent their days and nights confined to cots, fed gruel from a bottle propped up against the edge. When it was time to wash them, staff hosed them down with cold water. Human contact was minimal. Around the world, couples seeing the pictures on TV went to extraordinary lengths to adopt these children. Eventually, 324 toddlers came to Britain. But what no one knew was how these children would fare. Not even the eminent child psychiatrist, Professor Sir Michael Rutter from the Institute of Psychiatry, could predict what would happen. And he says most of his guesses proved wrong. For 2 decades, he's followed half of the Romanian children who came to Britain. And there's no denying that for him, it was an extraordinary opportunity. Here was a natural experiment of the kind you could never engineer, and with children who entered institutions as tiny babies. Professor Rutter studied the children at the ages of 4, 6, 11 and 15, and still knows them now that they're approaching 20. I asked him what he'd learnt from them.
To begin with, there was a very substantial degree of recovery in the couple of years after leaving the institution. It was gratifying that even with these dreadful conditions, that the improvement was spectacular. What we didn't know was the extent to which there would still be deficits, and we found there were still deficits in a substantial minority. But there were several aspects of that which were completely unexpected. To begin with, at all of our follow-ups, we have found no deficits in children whose institutional deprivation ended before the age of 6 months. That's not to say that at an individual level there was no child who wasn't affected, but it is to say that the differences were so small that we couldn't measure them. The second thing, though, is that the rate of deficits jumped up to about 40% in the second half of the first year, so that something happened, and happened very quickly. Then the expectation I think we all had was that the main effect would be in the sort of common problems, emotional disturbances, conduct problems, aggression, things of this kind. That isn't what we found at all. What we found was a set of unusual features, autistic-like problems, which we certainly hadn't expected, attachment-type problems, certain kinds of hyperactivity, and so on. And the usual expectation is that the more that time goes on, the less the effects of whatever adversity or stress it was. We didn't find that. These persisted right through to age 15. The association with the institutional deprivation was as great at 15 as it had been at 4.
So does that suggest that there's something very special going on in that 6 to 12 month stage that is much harder to overcome later on?
Yes, yes it does. So that we found that many of these children were malnourished, but not all were. What we found was that in the group who had not suffered from subnutrition, the effects on head size were very marked after 6 months. It wasn't just, as it were, it affected their mental functioning, it was affecting their brain development, because by and large the size of your head is a pretty good index of the size of your brain. So that, yes, there are important things biologically happening, but there are two things that weren't quite so expected. The first was that whereas the catch-up in height and weight was reasonably quick, so that after 2 years they were normal levels, head circumference was still way down, but was continuing to grow, so that even at 15 it was down, but it was less down, relatively speaking, than at 11, and compared to 6 and 4 even more so. But then there was the other aspect, which was that, well, you might expect that that is explaining everything, that biology is impaired, then psychology will be impaired. Well, we found that to some extent that was true, that the head size did account for some of the differences in psychological functioning, but a number of the children who had showed this persistence of deficits had achieved great successes, that it was not all bad. So we had, if you like, what sounds paradoxical but isn't really, which is that strong persistence but encouraging changes for the better.
And much more recently, you've just published a pilot study where you've been scanning the brains to actually look at the structure of some of the young people now. And you've actually found that they do seem to be different from other children of their same age. What the difference is?
I think because it's such a small pilot study, it'd be unwise to comment on that, other than to say that it did show that the brain size and the head size were pretty strongly associated. But in the further follow-up, we'll hope to examine it more thoroughly, and we can then see what holds up and what doesn't.
And is the idea from that to find out something clinically that might be able to help people in this situation, or is this for scientific knowledge, if you like, of what happens to the structure of the brain?
Both, really. One has to start with what the scientific findings are, but obviously, like everyone else who's involved clinically, one hopes that it will be of use clinically as well.
And there does seem to be something of a paradox, doesn't there, that you could have these changes to the brain which would make you think, oh, there's just no hope, because if the brain didn't develop, then what can we ever do about that? Yeah. Yet, as you say, a lot of the children have gone on to be very successful, and for some people it's fine.
Yes, and the question is why? What accounts for that? And I think you have to assume that's not just random. So the challenge is to sort out what are the factors either in their institutional experience or in what happened to them in their adoptive families that made a difference. And this is something that in the further follow-up we will have to focus on.
Yes, because I suppose what you've got is a lot of devoted families here who saw these children on TV and went over and helped them. So you'd expect them all to be very devoted parents, and there not to be that big differences between them, maybe.
No, they aren't. They're not all the same, of course, but they had to be pretty determined, because it was a lot of bureaucratic obstruction at the beginning, and they have stuck with them.
And how much can we learn from these children when it comes to children who've grown up here who've been neglected or abused? Can we learn from these children's experiences?
Well, that's a really important question, but of course we didn't study that group, so we don't actually know. I think there will be similarities, but I think there will also be differences. But it's pretty important because, fortunately, children who've experienced these appalling conditions are rare. On the other hand, abuse and neglect is not rare. So can we generalise? Can we go from the one to the other? We must find out.
Professor Sir Michael Rutter, so what do we know already about the many children in this country who haven't suffered extreme deprivation in institutions like the Romanian children, but who nevertheless have experienced severe emotional and physical abuse? We spoke to Janet, who was born in Uganda, but after the death of her mother when she was 8 and then her father when she was 12, came to the UK when an aunt offered to take care of her. But when she arrived in London, she was immediately passed on to another aunt and ordered to call this woman Mother.
I remember calling her Mom straight away, but I didn't understand why until days later. And like, whenever we go to social services, or I remember my first appointment, they're like, you have to act really sad and pretend like things are crazy, like you and your aunt, you and your mum, well, to her mum, have nowhere to stay and be sad, act sad. So it sort of shattered the whole little fantasy that I had. But anyway, she managed to get housing after that. So I moved in with her, and things went disastrous from that point. She would just get angry. She would blame me for everything that happened. I was put on constant rules. I couldn't see anyone. I was always blackmailed. If you do this, we're going to send you back. And, you know, back home you have no one. Like, you know, like power struggle. Like, you know, I'm your power now. I could drop you off whenever I feel like, so you have to do whatever I tell you. It was just really dark and really lonely and so sad, because I was like a hideous animal that she hated.
4 years later, at the age of 17, Janet left the house. Her school tried to help her, but she still found that she was stalked by fear.
I still wasn't happy. You know, I still felt like she's there. So you still have this, I don't know if it's a shadow or just a being of someone. You're not with them anymore, but it's still somehow in your life. Like, they're still in your head, they're still on your shoulder. Like, you feel as if they're still watching what you're doing. Because it got to a point where I could not connect my emotions to my mental thinking. I just could not. I think something, but I don't feel it. And it's so hard, because you could really want to express an emotion, but I can't feel it. I'm like, what's love? What is love? And I see people every day, and I have to ask reassurance from people. I'm like, could you tell me what love is? How do you really feel it? What do you do when you love? It's like, I see it, but I can't feel it. You know, and then the self-esteem, the confidence is just so beaten down. I wouldn't want anyone to go through that. I absolutely wouldn't want anyone to. It's a crazy place to be in, and I wouldn't wish it upon anyone.
Janet was helped by Kids Company, the London-based organisation that's cared for thousands of children and young people who've suffered violence and abuse. Founder Camilla Batmangeli has seen how those early years change children and affect the way they think and behave later on.
The children we meet at Kids Company often come from home environments where they've been chronically violated through sexual and physical abuse, abandonment, huge humiliation. You're talking about children who see their mother's head cracked open with a machete and have to run, aged 4, to the telephone kiosk to call the emergency services. Or an 8-year-old whose mother repeatedly attempts suicide and the child is left having to call the emergency services. Without a doubt, from the observations that we've made at Kids Company, and we've now seen thousands of children like this, early deprivation and abuse has a significant impact on the individual's behavior later on. We need to recognize that a large number of these children are suffering from a syndrome, and the syndrome is a psychosocial violence adapting syndrome, i.e. their poor psychosocial circumstances is creating a situation in their brain functioning and in their thinking which predisposes them to use violence as a way of surviving. And what we've got to understand is that the children are not morally flawed. They are appropriately adapted to the environments into which they're born. But this adaptation, which was necessary at the time that they were surviving the abuse, becomes a chronic state that stays with them. And for the child to come out of this violence adapting state, they need very specific treatment and support. A lot of research has been done on trauma in soldiers, but the clinicians must realize that some inner city children actually are exposed to greater violence than a soldier is at an age which is much younger and without the training that a soldier has. Therefore, these children are likely to be suffering from the same trauma syndromes as those who've gone to war and been traumatized. Therefore, clinicians need to pay attention to this situation too.
Camilla Batmangeli from Kids Company. Dr. Felicity De Zulueta is a consultant psychiatrist in psychotherapy who runs the Traumatic Stress Service at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. She believes that if you scanned the brains of children who've suffered abuse and neglect here, you'd expect to see similar changes to those in the Romanian children we were talking about earlier.
Yes, you would expect. And of course, for me, trauma and all the symptoms that we've described and that you've seen in the Children and Kids Company are due to attachment, failure and damage.
So this is very early on in life.
These brains have been sculpted by the experience they've been through in early life. The brain of a little child is like a semi-primed computer that is waiting to be stimulated, modulated by the mother and the father, the caregivers. And these little brains have to go through an experience of being cared for and responded to in order that they can modulate emotions. These children, they can't do any auto-regulation because a baby, if you look at a baby, when it's upset, you see it goes blue in the face. It's in a terrible state. And it's the mother soothing her, talking, her caressing, her moving with her, dancing, that is so absolutely crucial for the development of our brains so that we can relate to each other, we can empathize with people, and we can modulate our terrible emotions. And that's one of the features that is very characteristic of these children who are very damaged by constant neglect and abuse at the same time.
If you can see these long-term changes in the brain, could you ever see a day where you could use brain scanning to make a diagnosis of what's happening to them?
There's a tremendous appeal in brain scans. People seem to want to see the evidence, as if it's not already there. We have masses of evidence of brain damage in the way the brain responds to, the attachment research. There's masses coming out of the States showing what damage these brains have, how they overreact, how the hormones are out of pace, how certain areas are completely dysfunctional. And there is a limit to the validity. It's a very useful instrument. For instance, in PTSD, you put somebody under a brain scan, a PET scan in this case, and you make them listen to the traumatic event. What you notice in their brain is that actually at the time when they are hearing the traumatic event, there's a shift from the left hemisphere, there's a shutdown in the speech area, and the shift to the right hemisphere, where is the paralimbic and limbic system, where all our memories and emotions are held. And very interesting, that shutdown of the speech area correlates with what we know happens to people who are traumatized. Often children are mute with trauma, and they can't speak about it. And my grown-up patients also, they are in the room and they start talking about trauma and they go mute. So there's a lovely correlation between a scanner and a clinical experience, and that makes sense. Similarly, somebody who has come from a background of trauma, and that applies to the Kids Company kids, the lovely evidence given by Janet, the Ugandan girl, who says, I'm disconnected from feelings. She has had trauma with her parents and then traumatization by this fake mother here in this country. And she has a brain that has developed in order to survive a disconnection, because presumably if she were to feel the pain that she has, she couldn't, when she came to Kids Company, afford to feel. It would have been overwhelming, not having an attachment figure to contain her and give her the love and support that we need when we're upset. Because we're social animals. This is what people keep on forgetting. So Camilla, by giving attachment, by giving support, by giving loving care, has enabled her probably to gradually overcome this disconnection, and the attachment system, through the attachment system of the Kids Company, she has cured herself of her trauma, or is in the process of it. And that's what our work really is about. in fancy terms, all sorts of things, but basically it's giving people the attachment system.
So why is it that some people don't respond in that way? Because, you know, it's only fair to say that a lot of children who are neglected and abused don't become violent in the end. You know, there are some who this doesn't happen for. Can we learn something from them? How have they got that extra resilience? Why are
well,
they
that
okay?
is one of the things that people are looking into. Fortunately, not everything depends on home. If you form an attachment with a teacher, or a granny or an auntie, if you have that, that will become the sense that somebody has understood how I feel, how I am, what is going on for me, will protect you in the future against being re-traumatized and re-traumatizing others. So that's one. 2, temperament. And there are genetic factors.
But if we're seeing that there might be actual changes to the structure of the brain, as well as to how the brain functions, doesn't that make it all seem rather bleak and hopeless about how you're ever going to be able to help that person recover if their brain has changed?
It could seem, but actually the brain is extraordinary. We have so many millions of synapses in that brain that if we catch them young, we can do a lot. And even in older brains, I work with older brains, and if we can get hold of the crucial part of the problem, we can actually achieve change. And the adult at the end of that, having let go of that, is actually able to function and to get on with life.
Dr. Felicity Dezulueta. And if you've been affected by these issues, then for sources of support, do call the BBC Action Line on 0800 044 044.